So, ja, guten Abend, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Herzlich willkommen hier bei uns im KörberForum zu unserer heutigen Abendveranstaltung. Eine Veranstaltung, mit der wir unsere Reihe Stimmen der Freiheit fortsetzen. Bei dieser Reihe Stimmen der Freiheit werfen wir regelmäßig ein Schlaglicht auf die Lage von Demokratie, Menschenrechten und Meinungsfreiheit in verschiedenen Ländern. Denn die offenen Gesellschaften stehen weltweit unter Druck. Von den 196 Staaten der Welt behindern oder beschneiden 150 die Freiheitsrechte der Menschen, die dort leben. Nur 4% der Menschheit lebt aktuell in wirklich offenen Gesellschaften. Das zeigen jüngere Studien. Und in den Stimmen der Freiheiten lassen wir Menschen zu Wort kommen, die sich in ihren Heimatländern für Demokratie und für Meinungsfreiheit als eben zentrale Pfeiler offener Gesellschaften engagieren. Die bedroht wurden und deshalb hier in Deutschland, genauer in Hamburg, Schutz gefunden haben und in ein zumindest temporäres Exil gegangen sind. Die Stimmen der Freiheit richten wir mit Partnern aus. Mein Name ist Sven Tetzlaff und ich darf Sie im Namen von 2 der 4 Ausrichter willkommen heißen, der Körber-Stiftung und der Herbert und Elsbeth Weichmann-Stiftung. Beide Stiftungen engagieren sich in ihrer Arbeit für das Thema Menschen im Exil. Die Körber-Stiftung mit ihren Projekten im Arbeitsschwerpunkt Neues Leben im Exil und die Weichmann-Stiftung mit der Förderung wissenschaftlicher Exilforschung. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass wir die Reihe mittlerweile seit einigen Jahren gemeinsam mit der Hamburger Stiftung für politisch Verfolgte ausrichten können. Die Stiftung wird Ihnen gleich noch von Martina Bäuerle, der Geschäftsführerin, vorgestellt und gemeinsam mit der Süddeutschen Zeitung, deren Chefredakteur Wolfgang Krach das Gespräch heute Abend auf der Bühne moderieren wird. Das Land, über das wir heute sprechen, steht im Bewusstsein der meisten von uns weniger für Politik als für Traumstrände, faszinierende Unterwasserwelten und Luxustourismus, die Malediven. Ein Staat im Indischen Ozean, bestehend aus insgesamt rund 1190 Inseln. Aber es gibt auch die andere Seite, die von den Touristen wenig wahrgenommen wird. Ein Land geprägt von Jahrzehnten autokratischer Herrschaft und Repression gegenüber der Opposition. Unterbrochen von einer kurzen Phase der Demokratie von 2008 bis 2012, als Mohammed Nasheed der erste demokratisch gewählte Regierungschef des Inselstaats wurde. Aber er verlor sein Amt, wurde in einem umstrittenen Prozess zu 13 Jahren Haft verurteilt und ging schließlich ins Exil. Schnell gewannen Kräfte wieder an Einfluss, die dem alten Regime nahestanden. Unterstützt wurden sie von konservativen islamistischen Gruppierungen. Internationale Beobachter stellten regelmäßig die mangelnde Unabhängigkeit und Politisierung der Justiz fest. Die Meinungs-, Versammlungs- und Pressefreiheit wurden immer wieder erheblich eingeschränkt. 2007 wurde das erste religiös motivierte Attentat von radikalen Islamisten auf den Malediven verübt. In den darauffolgenden Jahren gab es immer wieder Anschläge und es verschwanden Menschen. Im Vergleich zur Größe ihres nur 350.000 Menschen umfassenden Staatsvolks stellten die Malediven die zweitgrößte Ausländergruppe in den Reihen der Terrormiliz IS. Im September letzten Jahres dann setzte sich überraschenderweise der Kandidat der Demokratischen Partei Ibrahim Solih bei den Präsidentschaftswahlen gegenüber dem autoritär regierenden Jamin durch. Bei der kürzlich abgehaltenen Parlamentswahl hat der aus dem Exil zurückgekehrte Ex-Präsident Mohammed Nasheed seine Partei ebenfalls zum Sieg geführt. Also wieder Hoffnung für Demokratie und Menschenrechte. Darüber werden wir gleich mehr hören. Ich freue mich, dass die Vorsitzende der Nichtregierungsorganisation Maledivian Democracy Network hier ist. Sie wird Ihnen gleich in der zweiten Begrüßung von Martina Bäuerle ein bisschen näher vorgestellt. An dieser Stelle darf ich Sie von meiner Seite ganz herzlich willkommen heißen. Willkommen, Shahindha Ismail. Welcome. Und wir freuen uns auf einen weiteren Gesprächsgast auf der Bühne. der uns als intimer Kenner der Malediven helfen wird, die Vorgänge in ein größeres Bild einzuordnen. Der Journalist John James Robinson ist ehemaliger Herausgeber der ersten unabhängigen Nachrichtenredaktion des Inselstaats. 2015 veröffentlichte er, man kann sagen, mittlerweile ein Standardwerk zur Politik der Malediven unter dem Titel Malediven Islamische Republik tropische Autokratie. Ein Jahr zuvor war er mit dem Alistair Cook Award in Journalism ausgezeichnet worden. Derzeit arbeitet Robinson bei der Open Society Foundation bei Programmen für unabhängigen Journalismus kleinerer Medienunternehmen. Ihnen ebenfalls ein ganz herzliches Willkommen hier bei uns, Herr Robinson. Ich freue mich jetzt auf das Gespräch und wie bei uns üblich können Sie im Nachgang zu dem Gespräch auf der Bühne die Themen weiter vertiefen bei Getränken und kleinen Snacks hier bei unserem Nachempfang. Und noch ein Hinweis in eigener Sache, wir führen momentan auch Befragungen unseres Publikums durch, weil wir interessiert daran sind zu erfahren, wie diese Veranstaltungen von Ihnen wahrgenommen werden. Also ich würde mich freuen, wenn Sie mit dabei wären. Aber jetzt zunächst Bühne frei für Martina Bäuerle.
Auch von mir herzlich willkommen, liebes Publikum, lieber Sven, liebe Agatha, lieber Wolfgang Krach, liebe Shahindha und lieber Herr Robinson. Dank an alle Beteiligten dieses Abends. Ich freue mich jetzt, Shahindha kurz vorstellen zu können. Seit 33 Jahren lädt die Hamburger Stiftung für politisch verfolgte Menschen wie Shahindha Ismail ein, die sich für Demokratie und Freiheit in ihren Ländern einsetzen und deswegen verfolgt werden. Liebe Shahindha, offen gestanden wusste ich nicht oder wenig über politische Verfolgung auf den Malediven. Das hatte auch gerade Sven erzählt. Bekannter ist eher der dramatische Klimawandel, der die Insel bedroht, oder das beliebte Urlaubsziel. Jetzt aber weiß ich so viel mehr, dass die knapp 340.000 Einwohner der Malediven unter einem langjährigen Präsidenten gelitten hatten, der die demokratischen Grundrechte nach und nach eingeschränkt hatte, eine Regierung, die nichts tat, um der zunehmenden Gewalt gegen Andersdenkende entgegenzutreten, weshalb der Einfluss islamistischer Extremisten sich auf alle Bereiche des öffentlichen und privaten Lebens ausweitete. Und genau dagegen kämpfst du, liebe Shahindha, durch Protest, Aufklärung und Eingaben. Als Gründerin des Maledivian Democracy Network engagierst du dich seit über 14 Jahren für demokratische Freiheiten, Menschenrechte, religiöse Toleranz und unterstützt politische Gefangene und Verschwundene und unterstützt deren Familien. Dafür hast du in den vergangenen Jahren immer wieder und zunehmend Drohungen bekommen. Nach 14 Jahren hast du dir nun eine Auszeit gewünscht von den täglichen Anfeindungen und Einschränkungen. Ein Jahr, neue Kraft schöpfen, neue Kontakte knüpfen, unsere Zivilgesellschaft kennenlernen, das eine und andere bewährte System im Umweltschutz vielleicht auch kennenlernen, wie Mülltrennung, Recycling, Umdenken im Plastikverbrauch und vieles mehr. Der Anfang hat geklappt. Seit April bist du Gast der Hamburger Stiftung für politisch Verfolgte. Es gibt, das sagte Sven, Hoffnung auf eine bessere Zukunft auf den Malediven. Seit September 18 wurde überraschend der neue Präsident gewählt. Auch die Parlamentswahlen vor wenigen Wochen sind gut ausgegangen. Der Anhänger der neuen Regierung, die Anhänger haben eine Dreiviertelmehrheit. Das ist erstaunlich. Doch die harte Zeit ist nicht vergessen. Eine Schwalbe macht noch keinen Sommer. Es braucht Zeit, um einen neuen politischen Kurs durchzusetzen. Es braucht Zeit, Polizei, Behörden und Justiz demokratisch zu schulen, um Recht zu sprechen und Vertrauen aufzubauen. Und beide konnten mir zu Beginn des Jahres nicht ahnen, wie brandaktuell dein Kampf gegen religiösen Fanatismus auf einmal werden würde. Die vom IS reklamierten Attentate auf Sri Lanka haben gezeigt, wie groß die Gefahr des religiösen Terrorismus tatsächlich auch auf den Malediven ist. Laut der deutschen Botschaft ist die aktuelle Regierung nach den verheerenden Terroranschlägen höchst beunruhigt, dass so etwas auch auf den Malediven passieren könnte, und geht jetzt verstärkt gegen Islamisten vor. durch Ausweisung ausländischer Prediger, Überwachung von Moscheen und Kontrolle der Polizei von Gefährdern. Bin gespannt, was wir dazu noch heute hören werden. Deshalb noch einmal, wie schön, Shahindha, dass du jetzt bei uns bist. Stimmen der Freiheit heißt diese Veranstaltungsreihe seit 2012. Ein guter Titel, wie sich in diesen Zeiten beweist, in denen die Menschenrechte, die persönlichen Freiheiten, aber auch die Pressefreiheit an vielen Orten der Welt zunehmend unter Druck geraten. Und das auch bei uns. Denken Sie an die Vorkommnisse im letzten Jahr in Chemnitz, Bilder zum Neonazi-Aufmarsch zu Ostern in Plauen. Die Verrohung der Sprache und des Umgangs miteinander sind nicht hinzunehmen. Wir müssen uns wieder aktiv für unsere Grundwerte einsetzen. Die Hamburger Stiftung für politisch Verfolgte macht da mit. Wir unterstützen Menschen wie Shahindha Ismail seit 1986. Wir tun dies, so hat es der Gründer, der ehemalige Bürgermeister Klaus von Donani formuliert, auch im Gedenken an die Verfolgten des Dritten Reiches, denen die Zuflucht in andere Länder verweigert wurde. Was tun wir? Wir laden Menschen für ein Jahr ein, die in ihrer Heimat nicht mehr sicher sind, weil sie sich für Meinungsfreiheit eingesetzt haben. Wir bieten ein Jahr Sicherheit, Neuorientierung, neue Kontakte, ein Forum für ihre so wichtige Arbeit. Das können Foto- und Bilderausstellungen sein, Lesungen oder politische Veranstaltungen. Damit sie dann, geschützt durch Kollegen und Institutionen in Deutschland und Europa, nach Hause zurückkehren und weitermachen können. Niemand, hat die UN-Flüchtlingsorganisation einmal plakatiert, lebt freiwillig im Exil. Unsere Gäste möchten zurückkehren und weiter für Recht und Gerechtigkeit kämpfen. Sie sind Stimmen der Freiheit, eine wichtige Kraft, auch um Fluchtursachen zu überwinden. Wir helfen dabei. Heute gibt uns Shahindha Ismail Einblicke in ihr Land. Unterstützt wird sie dabei von dem Journalisten John James Robinson. Beide kennen sich von den Malediven. Und weil es dafür einen Dritten im Bunde braucht, freuen wir uns auf die spannende Moderation von Wolfgang Krach, Chefredakteur der Süddeutschen. Danke, lieber Wolfgang, dass du für diesen Abend wieder quer durch die Republik gereist bist. Vielen Dank.
Ja, ich begrüße Sie auch noch mal ganz herzlich von meiner Seite zu diesem Abend. Ich freue mich sehr über die beiden Gäste. Und sowohl Herr Tetzlaff als auch Martina Beurle haben schon gesagt, wenn wir in Deutschland über die Malediven reden oder lesen, dann geht es in der Regel um Urlaub und um Strände und vielleicht ein bisschen noch um das Weltklima, weil ich glaube, die meisten Inseln sind nicht höher als 1 Meter. Und deswegen ist das ein großes Problem, der Klimawandel für die Malediven. Und heute reden wir über die Politik dort. Und normalerweise, wenn wir hier bei den Stimmen der Freiheit über Länder reden, wo die Freiheitsrechte beschränkt werden, auch die Presse beschränkt wird, dann reden wir über Länder, die wir alle kennen, wo wir wissen, dass es so ist: Syrien, Iran, Türkei und andere. Und heute finde ich sehr erfreulich, dass wir über ein Land reden, über das wir hier in Deutschland, glaube ich, sehr wenig wissen. Wir werden die Diskussion in dieser Runde hier auf Englisch führen. Das heißt, es gibt aber ja die Headsets, wo Sie alle sich das übersetzen lassen können. Wir werden ungefähr vom Ablauf her 1 Stunde hier auf der Bühne diskutieren und würden dann öffnen, damit Sie auch die Möglichkeit haben, Fragen zu stellen. Okay, Shahindha, we do hear a lot here about the Maldives related to tourism and to people spending their holidays there. If you would be asked to describe your country in 1 minute, what would you say, what are the Maldives?
I would say that half the world doesn't know about us.
Okay.
We are a very small community, and I think that our lives have been sheltered from the outside world, and everything that happens in the Maldives, it's kind of contained in the Maldives, and the entire picture that people get is different.
And how would you describe the present political situation? We had these steps, 30 years of an authoritarian regime till 2008. We had a president who was elected democratically till 2012. There was a coup then. We had the return of the old power, and now the election last year, 2018, that was surprising, with a new president and with the hope of political freedom. How would you judge the present situation also after the election that took place in April?
I think that Maldives going back and forth in our democratic journey has left the people very exhausted by now. And I think that the result of the last two elections, the presidential and the parliamentary elections, is because the people no longer wanted to tolerate the kind of political chaos that the country was constantly in. And I like to believe that the people genuinely want to do whatever they can through their votes to really make a change and make way for the government that has promised a lot more positive changes to do their job this time. I say this because in 2008, when we had the first democratic elections, what happened was, after the presidential elections, the parliamentary elections was lost. And so none of the legislative changes that the country needed to really move forward with accountability and the rest of the changes that we needed did not come through. And this time, after the presidential elections, there was a kind of a buzz around that everyone kept saying that this time we have to have the parliament because we need these changes.
J.J. Robinson, you were born in Wales and you grew up in Australia. How did the way of your life lead you to Mali?
I was looking for some sun. No, I've always worked as a journalist for most of my life, and at the time I was around 2008, early 2009. I was working as a business and technology journalist in London, and really looking to get back into the kind of journalism that I wanted to be doing, which was much more focused on human rights and politics and the sort of social development stuff that was going on outside the developed world. And I saw this ad in journalism.co.uk for a wanted editor of the first attempt at an independent English language news service in the Maldives. And I thought, that sounds like 70% chance it's a scam, but let's give it a go and see what happens. And the rest, I guess, is history. I lived and worked there for 4 years during, I would say, probably some of the country's most significant political changes, at any rate. It had about a 2-year lead on the Arab Spring. And
so you arrived there in 2009, or when did you arrive there?
Late 2009.
Okay.
Yeah. It had about a 2-year lead on the Arab Spring, and it was interesting to the 2008 vote rather was the that sort of brought democracy to the country, was the sort of event that precipitated a lot of the things that happened afterwards. But you could watch what happened in the Maldives in this very small, very kind of observable place that had the all the political, social, religious, economic, environmental challenges of many other countries in the world, but all shown up in microcosm. And you could watch what was happening in the Maldives and extrapolate out to many other problems in the rest of the world. So from this point of view, it was a fantastic journalistic, the journalistic interest was amazing.
And when you came there in 2009, did you have the feeling that of a new rising democracy there, or what was your feeling? Or did you also feel it threatened in any way?
Do you know, after a huge party like the one you're having in Hamburg this weekend, and you arrive on the morning afterwards, and it's very quiet. There's a bit of a mess. Everyone's in a good mood still, but it's hard to underestimate the changes, or hard to sort of overstate rather the changes that 2008 brought in. You had a ruler who'd been quite autocratic for 30 years, and there hadn't seemed to really be any hope of changing him in democratic fashion. Suddenly, overnight, this had happened. You had a new, young, progressive, liberal leader who was very vocal on issues of climate change and was set on taking the Maldives and leading on the world stage, despite being a very small head of a very small country. So it was enormously exciting. At the same time, changing a dictatorship is not necessarily, it's not just one person. There's an entire institution, an entire system, particularly in the Maldives case, the legislative structure, and especially the judicial system, which was a throwback to the former regime. The former dictator had selected the judges, had handpicked them to essentially fulfill his bidding, and something like 60% of them had less than grade 7 education and about 30% actual criminal records. And so even though you have a new, everything from, I think, embezzlement through to corruption and fraud, I mean, these were the judges. They were rubber stamping everything that the former regime wanted to protect the dictator and his establishment from any kind of investigation into corruption or the human rights abuses that had been committed. So while on the surface you had this vibrant new democracy, underneath it you had all the baggage of a dictatorship that had embedded itself and wasn't moving.
Shahindha, you are the chairwoman of Maledivian Democracy Network, and you started this work in 2004, so it was during the dictatorship. Maybe you can describe a bit the situation at that time in 2004, and the question is why and how did you start these human rights activities, and were you aware about the threats that could come up to you?
I was aware of the threats somewhat, but it was not what I expected. But anyway, in 2004, it was the first time that I was exposed to what was actually happening in the country as well. In 2003, actually, there was a death in prison. Someone was tortured to death. And then the following day, there was riots in the prison as well as in the capital city, and a shooting by the security forces, which killed 5 more inmates. And that's when the reality actually hit the ground in the Maldives. Until then, people were working from exile.
And was this the moment you politically woke up?
It was. Okay. It was. And there was so much international scrutiny on the Maldives that the then president was kind of forced to announce a reform agenda. He called it the roadmap to reform. And that is also when there was a public announcement by the president asking people to start talking about democracy and to be open about their expressions. And so my brother was an MP then, and he along with some of the other members of the then opposition, organized a series of debates, open debates, where public could come in and share their views about what was going on, and I volunteered to help. I was just helping with logistics then. I was sort of just there to make sure that people had seats to sit in and things like that. And I would sit at the back of the room while the discussions took place. And it was such a big shock for me to learn that this was what was happening in my country, and there was so much corruption and torture going on. About a week after that, there was a demonstration, and it was the first and biggest demonstration in the 30 years of my life then. Around 20,000 people must have gathered at the Republic Square, which is also right outside the security forces, the headquarters of the security forces. And the demonstration went on to the next day, when the forces cracked down and very brutally arrested around 300 or more people. And almost everybody that I worked with, when I volunteered for the open discussions, almost everyone was arrested. My brother was also arrested. And there were about 3 or 4 people left that I knew from the movement who had not been arrested. So the 3 of us got together and we decided that we were going to help the families of people who were in detention. And that's how we started our NGO.
Okay, so it was because you woke up politically and you saw that your brother was arrested, so you decided we have to do something.
It was not just my brother. It was we saw how brutal the security forces were, and we also knew that none of the families knew what was going on. They did not know what was happening with the people who were arrested. Maldives did not have a culture of allowing families to meet or visit people who are in prison or in jail. And that was also the first time through petitions from the families that we were able to start the culture of visiting people in prison as well.
And what were your first experiences you made after you had decided to engage and to start these human rights activities? How were the first weeks or months, and how did the regime react to that?
The most vivid memory from then is that every time I walked outside of my home, I would have 2 people following me. We were monitored where we went, who we interacted with, so the government was aware of the fact that we were engaging with the families and that we were organizing all these petitions and letters to the government. There was always the risk of being arrested. There were times when the security forces actually visited my home, but did not really recognize me, so they could not. I was saved by that. They also visited the small office that we operated to organize the gatherings then, and I was also in charge of the office at that time, especially since everybody else got arrested. So the forces came in there and confiscated all of the computers and documents that we had there, and that was also a time that I could have been arrested. I was questioned, but somehow they did not recognize me as someone who had also been at the demonstration and someone who had been organizing these things. So it may be due to lack of organization at that time on the side of the government as well, that the people who were left were not taken in after the initial few days. But the atmosphere after the arrests was full of fear. People were afraid, my family was afraid that I was doing what I was doing, and but still it had to be done. There were hundreds of families that did not know what had happened to their people. And there were reports of torture and people being secretly brought to the hospital, so that we just continued.
JJ, did you at that time where Shahindha is describing now, did you have any interest in what was going on the Maldives at the time, or didn't you watch it in any way?
I had no idea. There was, I think for my research, I looked for books on the Maldives. There weren't any, apart from The Lonely Planet, which is apparently the Lonely Planet's worst-selling travel guide, because everyone just books the resort through a travel agent. But this was the sole reading material I think I had there. At my farewell from my job in London, a colleague got me the Lonely Planet guide and the Dummies Guide to Islam and said, off you go. I think what Shahindha is saying is it's very hard if you've lived in a country that has a kind of tradition of justice and a judicial system to sort of understand and feel what it is like to be in a place where you could just be disappeared off the street and your family would not know. I mean, it inspires a huge sense of fear in your family. So the pressures on young people who want to go out and protest from older members of the family saying, just keep your head down, this will blow over, you don't want to put your head above the parapet because something might happen to you, is very, very high. And a lot of what happened during the last days of the Gayoom era, the former dictator, was custodial torture. So you would be, if you had displeased him, or sometimes if you were a minister and you'd fallen out of favor, or he would send you off to prison. There was no sort of limit to the detention, and it was a confession-based justice system. So you would essentially be in prison until you confessed. So it was kind of catch-22. If you were innocent, you stayed in prison, and if you confessed, you were guilty. So you were punished anyway. You didn't have any other option. And a lot of the torture took place in the prison behind the scenes where people couldn't see it. So when Evan Nassim was murdered in 2003, this young prisoner, I think it was his family made the decision, which was quite unique at the time, to display the body, to show people what had actually happened to him, that he had actually been beaten. He hadn't fallen. It was obviously a murder. And so this, I think, was the moment of political awakening when people realized that they couldn't put their head in the sand anymore.
And at that time, when you started your human rights activity after 2004 and after the uprising and the people who were arrested, how did the people get the information about what was happening? What about the media situation at the time? Because it was everything was under control. There were no free media. How did people in the country get the information what's going on in their own country?
People didn't know what was going on. So Maldives is a scattered nation. We have islands, and people living outside of the capital city didn't really know what was going on at that time. And unless they had somebody in prison at the time, And the only way that anyone could get any information from about the people who were arrested would be if you had someone inside the detention center, or someone working at the security forces who would be kind enough to give you some information. And there were people who gave us information. Otherwise, there was no media that could report on anything that was happening unless it was approved by the government.
And then the year 2008 came with the democratic election and the new president after the 30 years of Gayoom. How did you go through these elections, and what was your feeling at that time? Could you believe that, or did you have expected that, or was it very surprising? Or
it was not very surprising, but in the run-up to the final rounds of elections, I mean, there was obviously a coalition after the first round was over, and different political parties joined hands for the second round, which made it possible. What I remember most from that election was the unity that drove people to vote that time. Because when it came to the first round, there were about 8 contenders, and it was such a divided atmosphere at that time. But when it came to the second round of voting, it was, sorry. It was very clear that only a united front could win the election. And the atmosphere changed completely when campaigners and supporters from different political backgrounds came together. We had this communal space where all the campaigners gathered, and it was, I think because I was among these people who campaigned for the election, that it didn't come as a surprise, because there was so much hope. And still, I remember that everybody stayed up all night when the vote counting was going on, and the result was announced around 3 or 4 in the morning. And it was such a jubilant day when the sun rose and everybody was out celebrating, and there were parties for an entire week or so. That would have been probably the only happy time during all these political changes in the Maldives.
And why did this happiness not go on after the election, after Mohamed Nasheed was the new president? What happened then?
I actually think that what happened after the election was that, for one thing, I think that all the changes were too rapid. I have always said that the changes that came about with the election were too rapid and too fast for our people to grasp. And that if democracy is not instilled in culture, then it is so easy to lose it again. And so the people were left behind. There were so many changes that were coming. So that there was, I think, no real grassroots holding the changes together. But at the same time, I think that one of the roots of the problems in the Maldives is that there is so much corruption that everyone is sort of entangled in it, and money just changes things in the Maldives.
JJ, when you came there a year later in 2009, do you share this what Shahindha said, that the situation was it had come too surprising to the democracy, and that it was not a stable situation, or what was your feeling when you arrived there?
I think the key word Shahindha mentioned was the coalition. I mean, you had Mohamed Nasheed, who was the face of the government, but they won that election with the support of all these other people, including many ministers inside Gayoom's government, who had effectively turned on him and opportunistically, in some cases, decided to try and run against him, or by supporting the change, had isolated themselves from the regime and were now in a position where they had to support the democratic movement for their own survival. And so these coalition partners were not by any means natural democrats. They were people who had operated within the regime quite happily, but were now in a position of essentially being in power and having ministerial positions under the new government. So while the majority of the government was this new sort of fed by this new democratic sentiment, not everybody in it was necessarily that way inclined. Particular group was the Adalith Party, the religious group, who allied, where there were a political Islamic movement who allied themselves with Nasheed and the Maledivian Democratic Party. And for Nasheed's side, this was important because the Maldives, being a 100% Islamic country, on paper at least, I'm sure we'll get into that later, because of that, they needed, the MDP needed these coalition allies to come in and help support them to win this vote. So when I got there, this coalition had started to fall apart, and the MDP was increasingly on its own, while these partners had various cross purposes. You know, somebody wanted a ministry and they were told no, or even it got quite petty to the point somebody, you know, wanted a diplomatic passport and wasn't given one, so they stomped off in a huff and, you know, declared war on the government. At the same time, the opposition, it was a bloodless transition, which I think is quite unique for that part of the world. I mean. At the same time, overnight, the regime became the opposition. The state media that was in control essentially privatized overnight and became a kind of businessman-controlled oligopoly. And then you had the parliamentary elections, which came the following year, and the former dictatorship did not make the same mistake it had made, which was to assume it would win the presidential election. They poured loads of money and time and effort and resources into making sure they got a parliamentary majority. And because the new constitution heavily empowered the parliament, the intention had been to try and defang the presidency and reduce the power of the autocracy, parliament was incredibly powerful. And so you had a democratic presidency with a coalition that was disintegrating, and underneath that you had the judiciary, which was, I think insane would be a kind way to describe it at that point. And you had this parliamentary body, this legislative authority, which was massively powerful and influential and controlled by the former regime. So it was not a stable situation, even though on the outside it might have looked like it was quite liberal, quite progressive.
In 2012, there was the coup and the return of the old dictator family. I think you were the only international journalist at that time who was in the Maldives. How did you go through these days, and what did you report on this coup?
Well, the government, by this point, there had been continual clashes with the judiciary. There was a lot of hate speech that was coming from the opposition, the former regime. They had run into a point where the government was trying to implement judicial reform and was actually waiting for outside assistance, I think UN and Commonwealth. By this time, the Commonwealth rather had a judicial reform team that was due to land actually on the day of the coup. And there'd been a stalemate between the judiciary and the government, and that was very high stakes for the former regime, because if they lost the judges, they lost the impunity that they had enjoyed from investigation for human rights and corruption and this legacy of things over the last 30 years. So this was an end game for them. When the coup took place, I remember getting a call at there'd been some clashes with the police between the opposition and the police the night before, and the police had backed away from separating the government supporters and the opposition supporters, and there'd been some clashes. But that wasn't in and of itself abnormal. But I remember getting rung up at about 7 a.m. and Maldives is sort of it's not a morning town, I'll put it that way. When anything's happened, if you get a phone call at 7 a.m., it means someone's been up all night. And so I got this phone call and went to the sort of main square, and there I saw the police. A good percentage of the police had actually mutinied, and some in uniform. They had joined the regime demonstrators, of which there were only ever a few hundred, started handing out riot gear, which was important because this meant that if you had like a riot shield and gas masks, then the tear gas isn't going to do anything. So the police had mutinied, and they were fighting the military. The military were in Republic Square, this sort of quite contained, quite small space, and the military were in their headquarters firing tear gas, and the demonstrators. I got the feeling that a lot of the control had completely broken down. There was complete impunity, and I think that was probably the only moment there when I was really scared that there was just you had no idea which way this was going to go, because nobody was in charge, and it was rapidly escalating. And so I observed from the side as the police and the military clashed, and then pretty much Maldives lit up as a story that day. It became sort of front page news everywhere. Life got pretty interesting very quickly.
Shahindha, did this have, the coup in 2012, did this have at that time any reaction for tourism and for people who came to the country, or didn't affect this in any way?
It did have some effect. I think that tourism went down for a period of time after the clashes, but it was so contained still. The news was not going out, and I can remember that several groups actually tried organizing boycotts on the Maldives, and immediately there was a bill tabled at the parliament that prohibited calling for any kind of boycott, and it was passed, but somehow it was not ratified by the president. But there was so much intimidation against anyone who called on tourists not to visit the country. So there was, at the time, what eventually groups did was, I think the website is still up. There was a website called Ethical Maldives, where they listed hotels that did not contribute to the coup. And promoted those, so if anyone was coming to the Maldives to choose wisely and things like that. But it didn't really affect tourism, not to my knowledge.
I mean, it's to give you a picture of the structure of the Maldives, you have the capital city, Male, which has about a third to half the population. It's 140,000, at the time 140,000 people, probably more like 180,000 people now, in about an island 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. It's very, very small. It is one of the most congested cities on the planet. I had a journalist colleague at once calculated just on the back of an envelope that if every Maldivian came down from the concrete towers at the same time, they wouldn't physically fit on the island. So you have this, on one side, this incredibly congested, very psychologically difficult place to live in, I think, is probably one way to describe it. Everybody knows everybody else's business. Yes. Politics is kind of followed like a football team. You have all these kind of family links and connections. Everyone's kind of watching all the time. Privacy is not really a concept. And then on the flip side, you have the tourist islands. And the tourist islands are these idyllic postcard, gorgeous sandy beaches. The way the Maldives is actually set up as a structure, you fly in on the jet, you land on the airport island, which is separate to Male, the capital city. It's next door. From the airport, you get either a seaplane or a speedboat, and that takes you to your resort. And your resort is a separate island. So unless you're near Male and you can see all the smoke coming up from tear gas and fires and things like this, you don't actually set foot onto an island a Maldivian would consider to be inhabited. The resorts are considered and labelled as uninhabited islands, even though 600 people might live and work there. They are completely and totally isolated. In many ways, the resort islands are, the best way to think of them are a separate nation state. They have their own currency, they trade in US dollars. There's no demand. Resorts don't actually place, when you pay at a resort, your money comes out of your card in dollars. It at no point creates pressure on, it at no point becomes a Maldivian currency. There's no transaction. It just goes straight out to a nice safe banking haven somewhere like Singapore or Malaysia. So you have this quite separate, quite isolated community that Maldivians live in that's totally different to anything a tourist would experience. I, for one, couldn't understand how you could sort of lie on a beach of one of these resorts nearby Male, see this, a bizarre and exotic capital city sitting in the middle of the Indian Ocean and not be curious about what's over there. But I don't know, feedback from tourists who've gone to visit Male, and sometimes people do, it's not a very likable city to visit. It's very unique, but it's not what people expect.
And Shahindha, did you ever try, with all your human rights things you did, to interest the tourists who spend their holidays there for these political issues?
It's close to impossible to interact with tourists. As JJ said, these hotels are located on individual islands outside of the city, and we're not allowed on those islands.
You're not allowed to go there?
Locals are not allowed on the islands. But from recent times, there are some resorts that have special packages for locals, but generally it's off bounds for us. So the only way that we could interact with a tourist would be at the airport itself, but would be heavily penalized if caught doing so. I also wanted to add to what JJ was saying just now. So the hotels on these islands organize day trips to the city, right? So they bring tourists to the city to look around. I don't know what they see, but so what was happening during the coup was the day following the coup until I think 2 months after, we had demonstrations in the city every day. And almost every day there would be confrontations with the police and loads of people getting arrested and all of these things, so that there was no more day trips to the city from the hotels. And whenever there was any kind of an unrest or a protest, or unluckily for us, because it is such a small community, and as JJ said, everybody knows everybody's business, so it was very hard to organize protests discreetly, so that these hotels would be informed not to bring in tourists to the city. And then there was also, in 2013, they passed the law on peaceful assembly, which outlined diameters where protests or demonstrations are prohibited. So we would only have to protest in areas not marked by these perimeters in the law. So it includes resort hotels, which means that even if the employees on those hotels wanted to protest against their employers, who, again, these resorts are also owned by politicians most of the times. You can't really distinguish between the business community and the political community in the Maldives.
And the criminal community sometimes.
True. So we're barred, anyone is barred from protesting or demonstrating in the hotel islands. And then these people are not brought to the city when there is any sort of demonstration going on. So it's completely sort of two different worlds in the Maldives.
And the employees of the hotels, they are also living on the resort islands, or where do they live?
It's split. So technically, under the Maldivian legislation for it, resorts have to have 50% local employment. Very few bother with that. It's some case maybe 30% Maldivian staff. So on any resort, you kind of, it's almost like a class system or a tier system. You have sort of often the Western hotel school people who sort of the head chefs and things like this. You have the middle ranks who are the sort of the accountants and the sort of services people in the middle. And the managerial mid-management. And then on the bottom rungs, you have sort of the housekeeping staff, the people who kind of work in the background. And it's often the local staff who are doing these kind of jobs. It's very common. It's entirely possible for you to land at the airport, get your seaplane, have your holiday on the island, go back to the airport and fly out and not have actually met or interacted with a Maldivian past the immigration counter. It's quite a unique and bizarre arrangement. Perhaps, possibly, during your stay in the Maldives, one night at the buffet, there might be, Maldivian night, and you might have a coconut or something. But other than that, I mean, it's very, very little.
Shahindha, I want you to come to another issue. It's religion. JJ mentioned it, that Islam is the state religion in the Maldives. 100% of the population are Muslims. So what's the role of religion in the Maldives traditionally and at the moment in politics?
I think religion has always been a political tool in the Maldives. It would be the end of the argument every time, that if you want Islam to thrive, you vote for a certain person. If you want to protect Islam, you support a certain political party or a certain government, and this has been the case throughout. But also, Maldives was, I think, the Islam that we used to practice in Maldives was unique to the Maldives, really. We were not such a conservative society pre-2005 or so.
The tsunami, right?
The tsunami was, yes, a great contributor. But the thing was that many of us do say this, that the only good thing that we had during the 30-year-old regime was that he had a handle on the extremists and radicals. Although it existed and these groups operated underground then, they were not free to recruit people or spread their narrative so much at that time. But we have always been a constitutionally Islamic nation. And up until 2016 or 2017, the law was silent on what happens if you leave faith. But I'm not sure if it was, I think it was 2017, the government actually published policy saying that if you leave the Islamic faith, you would lose your citizenship along with it. But otherwise, traditionally, culturally, we had our own culture, and we were a very sort of moderate Islamic nation until, I would say, after the tsunami, and then the tsunami was used by radicals as an opportunity to really instill the fear of religion into the people. And it was also the same moment when the democratic movement and all the freedoms came with it. So, as JJ mentioned earlier, the religious groups were a big part of the movement that toppled the autocratic regime in 2008. And so they had a stronghold by the time the government was formed. It was part of the coalition, and interestingly, throughout the last 4 governments, the Adalat Party has maintained the portfolio of the Islamic ministry. I mean, even though they were not part of a coalition. That is how strong they became during all the changes. And I think that this opened a way for a lot of different groups, religious groups, and radicalized groups, different levels of radicalism here, to operate freely. And I think that the movement that they have is so well organized and so well funded that it has now come to the point that it's almost impossible for anyone to gain any control over what these groups do or how they operate or the level of power they have achieved in the government as well as in the society itself.
And when you came there, JJ, what was your observation about the role of religion, about the role of Islam, and also about the role of women in this Islamic society? How did you see that?
Well, on the plane, as I said, I'd read the Dummy's Guide to Islam, so I was fully qualified by that point. I had a lot of learning to do. The website, the news site I was working for, was editing, it was the first platform for free expression in the Maldives, essentially after the end of the autocracy. Twitter hadn't really taken off at that point. So this was kind of where people came to energetically and enthusiastically air their views and fight each other's views. At the same time, constitutionally, the constitutional Islamic thing is quite important, because in the Maldives it's not just you're religious. If you're Maldivian, you are Muslim. There is no distinction constitutionally. It's also, it says its freedom of expression is permitted subject to the tenets of Islam. So whoever is in the country saying that they control those tenets, or has, saying they have the authority on what those are, because I mean interpretation is really wide, has an enormous amount of power over who can say what and control of censorship. So I had to sort of learn the basics pretty fast to be able to sort of manage and work on how to moderate what these comments were. Because we were held liable as a news outlet. We were vulnerable if somebody wanted to get at us. They could post people would often post a comment that was sort of anti-Islamic, and then from the same IP address below it, post a comment saying, "This is terrible what you're saying about Islam." It was the same person was trying to sort of make a comment and then set us up as a way to shut us down. We used to call it sock puppeting, because you had one person saying this and another person saying that, the same person. So it was quite a learning curve for me. At the same time, it was a fairly vibrant time. People were really trying to embrace this freedom of expression that was happening. It hadn't existed. I mean, when I got there, first of all, and I think it came back during the regime that followed after the coup, you'd sit in a cafe in Male. In Male, there's not much to do except ride around the city on your motorbike and sit and have coffees with people. It's got quite a strong cafe culture. But at the same time, you were very careful about who was sitting around you, who might be listening to you. That kind of, the ability to sort of have a free conversation with people didn't really exist outside the internet, and at that point, the publication I was working on. So this was quite striking for me.
And what about the role of women? How do you see it?
Maldives actually has the world's highest divorce rate by a factor of 2, I believe. It goes sort of Maldives, Belarus, United States. There's no stigma to getting a divorce. There's huge stigma to having a child out of wedlock. But at the same time, it's surprisingly liberal when it comes to divorce. I found that obviously there were many problematic things with it, and you saw a lot of Maldivians would say that the number of people wearing headscarves had dramatically increased over the past decade or so. This was kind of the visible thing that alarmed people, but in my practice, I didn't really see. Plenty of people wore headscarves to one of the most innovative things was to sort of keep the mobile phone wedged in there as a hands-free. It was a way to do that. But I mean, this for many people was a visible example of it. It was quite uncommon to see elderly women over the age of about 50, 60, not wearing a headscarf. It was evident that the political, religious pressure was kind of being instilled into an older generation and then being pushed down through the generations onto younger people who struggled with it. I think actually the way this influence came in from outside was very much through language. The Maldivian language is Devehi. It's got a beautiful script that looks like shorthand. It's quite unique. And the Quran was translated into Devehi. But then you had these scholars coming from abroad saying the Quran originally is written in Arabic, so to understand it, to know what to do, you need to read it in Arabic. If you don't understand Arabic, that's okay, we'll interpret it for you. You're doing it wrong, you should be doing it this way because of language. So you had Maldivians being offered, without much in the way of tertiary education, would be given an opportunity by some imam to go get a religious qualification in a madrasa in Pakistan or something like this, would get a few words of Arabic, would then come back and say, I know how to do this now. And this whole sort of Wahhabist influence came in from this Arab style of Islam, and it was complete cultural assassination of the traditional Maldivian practice of Islam.
Yeah, I also want to ask you, how do you see that? I mean, about the growing fundamentalism in Islam in Maldives. When did this start, and how did it touch you?
I think it started at this sort of intensity since, unfortunately, 2008, when everything was out in the open and the religious groups were free to, start. There were public lectures and sermons by radicals all the time, and it was televised, and it was everyone was listening to it, and it was so terrible. The fear factor that came with it, to the point that when there was a public sermon of certain scholars, local scholars, some families could not say no. They were afraid not to be seen attending. And it was, we actually could see a lot of danger when this started. And I remember that about 40 individuals went to meet with the president then, raising concern about the rising fundamentalism and what it could bring, but it was unfortunately not taken very seriously at that time. And it's just that they have sort of consumed the public space now, and anybody who is so much as raises a question to something that these people say are very quickly labeled as apostates or as anti-Islamics. And I can remember that one point of narrative that has stayed consistent throughout my work as a human rights defender is when the UDHR was discussed in the Maldives and when it was first introduced, I think it was again around 2004 and 2005. The only argument that was raised against the UDHR was that the fact that it had freedom of religion in it.
UDHR?
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what's sad about it is that at the time, in 2005, it was not just the religious groups, it was more used politically by the government to discredit human rights defenders. And there was no education or discussion around the fact that the Maldives has a reservation on that article of the UDHR. Regardless, from then onwards, all human rights organizations, anyone speaking about human rights is labeled as an anti-Islamic because being a human rights defender is associated with defending the right to freedom of religion. And so everything that we do is anti-Islamic. And then now it has come to the point that anyone who questions anything politically or religiously is very quickly labeled into this group of anti-Islamic people, and then there is so much hate speech out there, and these groups operate in full impunity. Nobody dares to take a step against them.
The then president in 2017, in December, he said that there should be no other religion in the Maldives than Islam. And you published a tweet then, and you reacted. And it's a very short tweet, and I just want to give it to you. And you wrote, "Religions other than Islam exist in the world because Allah has made it possible. No other religion would exist if not. Is it not?" That's what you published.
It is what I published. And if I may correct you on what the president said, my tweet was in response to a news headline that was tweeted by one of the media houses. In the news headline, it said, quoting our president, the then president, that he would not allow for any other religion to exist. It did not say the Maldives, and this is precisely why I challenged this sort of God complex that I like to call it that he had. And it was unfortunately nothing to do with religion. When I tweeted that tweet, I have commented vastly on religious extremism and some of the very silly arguments that religious scholars have promoted in the Maldives. But this one was, I was just trying to mock the president because he seemed to think that he was the person who allowed for a religion or not. Ironically, I was accused of mocking God again. So yes, President Yamin constantly gave out this message. So whether it was a national function or whether it was a private function or a social event, the moment President Yamin had a microphone in his hand, he would give the message about not allowing for disbelievers or anyone other than Muslims. And his second message always was that he would surely implement the death penalty in the Maldives and that nobody would be able to stop him from doing that. Luckily for us, we were able to stop him.
So we have a new president now since last year, since the autumn 2018, and a new majority in the parliament since April. What, JJ, what do you think? How could this affect the situation of the country? And does it? Do you feel some hope rising in you now, or what do you think?
Yes, there was the real change wasn't the election of Solly last year. I mean, I think that was hopeful for people because Yamin had been removed, and that suddenly I think Yamin had perhaps after a certain time as an autocrat you remove a lot of your friends and a lot of you sort of lose the people around you who are brave enough to tell you what they really think. So your advice starts to get pretty bad. And it seems that he may have overestimated the level of support he actually had, while also stripping the Elections Commission of anyone competent and able to hold an election to a level that you were able to rig it. So all the people who were competent at rigging the election had also been pushed out of the Elections Commission. So when they did have it, it was a paper job, and he ended up losing it quite comfortably. But it was actually the parliamentary election earlier this year that really set the hope in motion, because the MDP got Nasheed's old party and the president's party got a supermajority, and a supermajority is enough to do constitutional amendments, and that's absolutely critical because it means a lot of the really problematic elements in the constitution and sort of things that President Yamin had changed, a lot of these sort of institutional reform of things like the judiciary, which have been at the root of the problems in the Maldives. The supermajority gives the new government the capacity to actually get that through Parliament without having to make all of these murky deals with the coalition. So in that sense, it is quite hopeful. It's whether they have the space to do that now.
So Shahindha, the new majority in the parliament could also change the constitution and withdraw from the statement that Islam is the state religion. Do you think that could happen?
I don't think it will happen. I mean, while we have a supermajority, and as you've said, they can also change the constitution, but when it comes to Islam, there is this hold on politicians. It's very difficult to describe, but I genuinely don't think that it will make changes around things to do with the religion. Also, I mean, when we speak about a win and hope and, all these changes that we want through the parliament, I think that the parliament we have elected this time will be tested very, very closely, because for one thing, we have the parliament is not a very popular institution in the Maldives. We have, I think the Maldives would have the highest rate of flow crossing.
Of?
Switching parties once. So
it's like a football transfer market.
Exactly. So parliamentarians are not very respected, and they're very hard to rely on. So personally, I feel a little bit anxious about how things are going to go with this parliament, and I sincerely hope that the changes will come through with this parliament before it disintegrates in some form. But because of the history of this changing of parties and people going against party lines, and there is just no respect for parliamentary etiquette in the Maldives. I don't think that parliamentarians are even aware of these things. And about changes that have to do with religion, I think before that, Maldives is, the society is very controlled by politics. It is so polarized, it has been polarized for a long time now, that some things always ride over others, and priority is always falls on political changes. So that if there was a different issue that had to do with political competition, then that would always be the first, you know.
I'd like to open the discussion, but one last point I wanted to ask you. When you decided to leave the country and to apply for exile, to go to exile a few months ago, what did threaten you most? Why did you take this decision?
I have always been, as I said, labeled as an anti-Islamic, and I've faced a fair share of harassment online and in person as well. But following the tweet, there were a number of news articles that portrayed me as an apostate, and the fact that I should be killed according to Sharia was promoted so widely that I started receiving death threats, and people were just saying that they were going to kill me or attack me, and nothing was done about these threats. And so I left the country at that time, but returned after a couple of months only to be summoned to the police, and there was a criminal investigation against me for the same tweet again. And since then, for a few months, I had to hire private security personnel so that someone would accompany me wherever I went. The police also insisted on, interestingly, providing me with personal security officers. And I realized very quickly that there was another motive to it, so that I withdrew from this assistance. And after I withdrew from personal security assistance, I found myself not being able to freely move about in my city. And if I was to move around, I had to have someone accompany me. And this was just, it was too stressful. And more and more often I found myself staying indoors. I moved my flat to the same building where my office is located so that I don't have to walk on the road to it. And I just felt that it was not, I was not free in my own city anymore.
And what is the feeling now to be in exile and to see these dramatic changes in the political system there, and to have the supermajority with the election just a few days after you had arrived here in Germany?
I actually arrived a couple of days after the election. Right now I have very mixed feelings. One is that I feel very safe here, and I have the peace of mind, and that I noticed that I can focus more on what I am doing, whether I am researching something or working with I'm still working with my NGO, so I'm able to focus more. But at the same time, this is a very exciting time again in my country, and I think that I would be able to do a lot more if I was there. But then again, when I weigh one or the other, I think that my safety is still more important. Even though these changes have come about, I don't think that Maldives is still a safe place for people like me who are challenged by religious extremism.
There is particular concern about fighters from abroad. I think at the beginning you might have mentioned that Maldives is one of the top contributors of fighters to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra in Iraq and Syria on a per capita basis out of almost any other country. And the worry is these people who are coming back now, and with these sort of networks and connections and skills and connections to people who have skills. So there's a real fear that the situation is now out of hand and almost out of the Maldives' ability to manage. So it's more dangerous.
Okay, so I would like to give you the chance to ask some questions if you want. Peter Matthias Gede. Yeah, you just wait for the microphone, so.
Thank you. I'm Peter Matthias. 2 questions for Shahindha. The first one is, I was told that the big mosque on this artificial island beside the airport and beside Mali was a donation of Saudi Arabia. So my first question is, if we are talking about Islam in the Maldives, is it the Wahhabism which is going stronger? Second question, whenever I travel to the Maldives, I try to get in contact with young people, ask them about their society, about their life, and so on. And they are quite open-minded and well, they're not shy in a way. But of course, it was always a very special situation, being a luxurious client and asking employees of a hotel resort. But anyhow, what do you think? Will this tourism create people among the Maldivians which are a bit kind of split personalities? I mean, tourism is very important for the economy. I think more than the tuna fishing, meanwhile. So on tourism, lots of people depend. And they see all the rich people coming from Europe, coming from Japan, from Russia, from China. What special feelings does this situation create on the young Maldivians who are working on these resort islands?
To your first question, Wahhabism is on the increase. And I see it evolving over the past few years. And currently what is happening is that there is a rift between the Salafis themselves. And there is absolutely no control, as I said before. So there is the only common ground that all of these religious groups agree on is that anyone who questions the arguments shall be, banished or killed. Otherwise, there is a rift, meaning that there is a stronger group of Wahhabis forming or organizing themselves in the country now. To your second question, your use of the word split personality, I think, describes it. I can give you an example. There is one island in the central atolls where there was a confrontation between Islamists and the law enforcement around 2007. And it is considered what we call a hotspot for religious extremism or radicalism, where people have also flown out to fight in wars. And I have visited this island a few times on our programs on countering violent extremism. And I discovered on my last 2 trips to this island that they have an extremely beautiful beach on that island. I discovered that this beach is used by a 5-star resort next to it for their guests to use. And I saw, the usual beach scene where people wearing bikinis or swimwear. And I was very surprised, and I asked them how it was that they allowed for it, because we certainly aren't. We would be arrested for it or killed. And they said it's okay. And they actually told me that I was free to do whatever I wanted, and I was made very welcome. But this was after a workshop with the community there, discussing what they believed to be religion and what we could or couldn't do. And it was such a big contrast from what they said inside the room to what they were saying outside.
Okay, hier eine Frage.
Bente. Shahindha, and maybe also to you, John, you were talking about all the corruption and all the money that is flowing into the system and that the government is thriving on. And I'm asking myself basically two questions, one looking forward with the new government. The first is, where's the money coming from? I would suppose that some of the money is coming from tourism, so maybe from some kind of royalty agreements with hotel groups and others, which then, in my opinion, would be at least an element to think about, whether you could talk to some of the hotel groups trying to be ethical, also communicating them being ethical to us all as a tourist, to say, well, do they try to have some influence on what the government does? And I think another observation, really looking forward, I think you have seen in the world so many governments that come with good intentions and that substitute an old government, but money always is a strong and sometimes not a very ethical incentive, of course, for also, excuse me, new governments to be inclined to follow the rules of corruption. So I would be very much concerned, and maybe you are, what the future brings in terms of people coming with good intentions and then at the end of the day also getting into some kind of vicious circle of corruption. And is there any way that you could figure out where this kind of swamp of corruption could be dried out?
I could answer the first part, perhaps, on the economic side. So tourism is indirectly responsible for about 70% of the economy. Tuna fishing is, and it's getting smaller. In terms of foreign exchange, tourism is 90%. It's bringing in 90% of the outside money. And the reason why that's incredibly important is because the Maldives is an import-dependent economy. So it relies on imported oil to run all the transport, shipping, for the seaplanes, for all the resorts, islands that rely on desalination to get water. Every island has a power generator running on oil to run everything from the air conditioning to the lights, everything. All the food comes in. It's imported. On a resort, you might have your fancy, Norwegian salmon. In the Maldives is always a weird thing to have when you sort of look down and there's like X number of fish below your feet. But you have all of these, all the food comes in. It's imported. It's not really much. It's not a very fertile agricultural environment outside fishing because there's just not much land and it's mostly sand. But so you have this import-dependent economy relying on tourism for energy, for food, for basic subsistence. So if anything happens to tourism, that is an existential problem, not just for the Maldives economy, but for its food supply, for its energy, for the Maldives full stop. And this is why the Maldives is sort of perhaps unique among many other tourist countries with a sort of strong tourism environment like Sri Lanka, that there just isn't really that much else. So yes, it is an issue.
And the second question was to you, Shahindha.
I think that Maldives, not just the government, Maldives as a society has a very big challenge in moving past corruption, really. Corruption is so highly instilled. It has become a culture now. And going back to tourism, I think that there has always been high levels of corruption involved in things like how these islands are given or leased to individuals. If you look at the past, 30, 40 years, it's the same people who own these places. And then so much laws that are, laws are flexible for most of these people. And the lack of a respect for rule of law, I think, has to change before any of the other changes come in, really. And I still do have hope that these things will change. And so we have come to the point where we compare how corrupt the former president or the government or these individuals were as compared to now, or how corrupt the people now who are in power may be compared to what it was before, because it was so bad that at some level some things become acceptable because you're exchanging for something far worse. This is how corruption has been in Maldives. But at the same time, I think that there have been some solid steps already taken by the government, like there is a special commission who have been appointed to investigate special cases of grant corruption and for asset recovery, because so much of there have been so much of grant corruption as it has been reported by the Al Jazeera as well. I don't know if you are aware of.
Fantastic
documentary.
There
is a documentary film called Stealing Paradise. Yeah. So basically to deal with those corruption cases, and I think it is a vital step for the government to show their sincerity towards eliminating corruption in the country. The challenge that this commission faces right now is with the parliament, that a bill has been tabled at the parliament that gives special investigative powers to this commission and to a special commission that was appointed to investigate abductions, disappearances, and murders. But the parliament, for some reason, has people who will not allow for the passage of this law. So that shows the kind of dynamics we're talking about.
On your point too about the hotels, I think from the hotel perspective, that's an interesting one, because historically the Maldives had a 6-year return on investment for a tourism resort. So as long as Gaim's been in power for 20 years, it looks like he's probably going to be in power for another 6. That's money in the bank. You can sort of you can bet on that. In terms of the hotels now, they have managed to make so much money by keeping their heads down and staying out of politics. And occasionally, when a resort does get involved in politics, it's been great for the headlines locally. Anyway, put it that way. But the resorts themselves like to stay out of the politics, and the international hotel companies are very quick to say, "Oh, we just have the management contract. We don't have anything to do with this. It's entirely down to the local owner, local businessman." So they remove themselves from any responsibility and don't seem that interested in it.
We have the chance for our last question. Okay.
The Isles are living on imports, then the Islamic movement should be very careful, because if they blow up a few houses or a few buildings, nobody will come anymore. So what's going to happen? That is not Sri Lanka. Do you understand what I mean?
So the question is, are terrorists rational?
There is this sort of image that the Maldives, even Maldivians, have, that nothing is going to happen inside the Maldives, that people are just leaving to Syria or Iraq or wherever. And to be very frank, people were not expecting anyone to return from those wars either. We're having to deal with the returnees now. So it has been very difficult, even inside Maldives, to convince people that terrorists aren't rational and that they don't care who is damaged by their actions, and that what happened in Sri Lanka could very easily happen in the Maldives too. There's this notion that nothing is going to happen inside the country, but there have been not as large scale, but there have been smaller incidents. Some incidents where the security forces were able to prevent something from happening in the very nick of time. But there have been people who have been caught designing explosives, people planning to plant explosives in the city, and there have been attempts to blast some places. And it's, for me, I think it is just a matter of time that something happens. I think it's a ticking bomb, literally. And there is also this understanding that these things will not happen in the resort islands in the Maldives. But I think it is very likely. And what I also want to share is that there is this sort of understanding between some groups, some religious groups, and some resort owners, not all of them, is that, for example, when these religious groups conduct their, what they call camps, educational camps in different islands, what they do is they approach hotels in the neighborhood and they ask for support, for example, in providing transport to bring in participants, for example, to provide catering for the camp. And there is no way that these resorts will say no to them. And I'm sure that everybody understands why. So they have this sort of hold on some of the businesses, and I'm sorry, I don't know exactly who and who are connected, but this is generally how it operates. So the moment that somebody is made unhappy, that's when something will happen. And you don't know how you make them unhappy, really. Okay.
Shahindha, JJ, thank you very, very much. You gave us, I think, a very interesting insight into a country that we all just know as a paradise, as a touristic site. And today we have learned that it's not only a paradise. So thank you very, very much for this interesting evening. And so any other questions can be asked afterwards now. Okay.
Hat euch das Video gefallen? Dann abonniert unseren Kanal, um kein Video zu verpassen. Schaut gern auch in unserer Mediathek vorbei auf körber-stiftung.de/Mediathek und folgt uns auf Facebook, Instagram und Twitter. Danke fürs Zuschauen und bis bald.